Have you ever felt like you're trying to change, but something inside you keeps pulling you back to the same place? Like there's an invisible pattern quietly sabotaging your decisions, weakening your discipline, and keeping you stuck in cycles you've already decided to break. And the most dangerous part is this. It doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels normal. It feels like you. But what if I told you that most of what you call who you are was programmed without your permission? And that there is a method used by some of the most powerful minds in history that can reprogram this from the inside out? Today, you're going to understand exactly how this works. And more importantly than that, how to start changing it starting today. Now, before we go any further, I want to invite you to do something simple, but meaningful. If this kind of message resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every video is designed to strengthen your mind, expand your awareness, and help you build a life with more clarity, direction, and purpose. And I'd like you to leave a comment with this sentence: "My mind is ready for a new level." Write it with intention. Because many times, transformation begins in the exact moment you decide to show up differently in your own life. Now, let's begin. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Why is it that even when you decide to change, something inside you seems to resist? You try to move forward, but you fall back. You try to focus, but your mind drifts. You try to build something new, but somehow you end up repeating the same patterns. And over time, that starts to wear you down, because it feels like no matter how hard you try, there's always something invisible pulling you back. But here's what almost no one understands. This is not a lack of discipline. It's not a lack of willpower. And it's not a lack of ability. There is something deeper going on, something operating in the background of your mind without your awareness. And for a long time, this went unnoticed. But some of the most brilliant minds in history began to see it. Napoleon Hill was one of them. After years studying some of the most successful people in the world, he reached a conclusion that very few truly understood. He didn't just find strategies. He found a pattern, a mental pattern, invisible, but incredibly powerful. And here's the most intriguing part. He never explained it directly. This pattern, this method, is not clearly organized in a single chapter. It's hidden, scattered between the lines, fragmented across ideas, disguised as concepts mentioned, but never fully revealed. And that's why most people read it and miss it. They go through the information, but never grasp the mechanism. They never understand what actually creates transformation. But when you start putting the pieces together, when you begin to look a little deeper, something starts to make sense. Because what Hill was really trying to show was not just how to succeed. It was how to reprogram the mind at the deepest level. And that changes everything. Because if the problem is programming, then the solution is not more effort. It's reprogramming. And here is the most important point of all. This hidden secret is not hidden because someone tried to hide it. It's hidden because most people never look deep enough to see it. But from this moment on, you're going to start seeing it clearly. And once you see it, you can't go back to being the same person, because you begin to realize that what you thought was your personality was actually programming. What you thought was your limit was actually conditioning. And what you believed was who you are can be rewritten. But for that to happen, you need to understand how this programming really works. And that's exactly what you're about to discover. To understand what is really behind all of this, you need to go back in time, long before books, before structured theories. Before anyone tried to explain success, there was only one question. Why do some people succeed while most do not? Early 1900s. A young journalist receives an assignment. Simple, on the surface. Interview the richest man in the world. That man was Andrew Carnegie. At that time, Carnegie was not just wealthy. He was the embodiment of what seemed impossible. A man who came from almost nothing and built an empire. But what that young journalist didn't know was that this would not be a normal interview. It wouldn't just be questions and answers. It would become something much bigger. The conversation started like any other. Direct questions, clear answers. But slowly, the tone began to shift. Carnegie wasn't just responding. He was observing, analyzing, testing, because he had already noticed something in that young man. Something most people don't have. Genuine curiosity, a willingness to understand, not just to listen. And then, at a certain moment, Carnegie did something unexpected. He completely changed the direction of the conversation. He stopped talking about money and started talking about patterns, principles, something invisible that separates ordinary people from those who build extraordinary results. He said there was a philosophy of success, something real, something structured, something that did not depend on luck or circumstances. But there was a problem. That knowledge was scattered, fragmented, hidden within the experiences of a few. It had never been organized, never clearly explained. And in that moment, he made a proposal that sounded risky, almost unreasonable. He challenged that young journalist to dedicate years of his life to studying the most successful individuals in the world and uncover the pattern behind all of them. No guaranteed income, no security, no immediate recognition, only a mission, and perhaps most importantly, no certainty that it would even work. Now think about that. Most people would refuse because of the uncertainty, because of the risk, because of the time. But that young man accepted, and that decision changed everything. His name was Napoleon Hill. Over the years that followed, Hill went deeper than anyone had before. He didn't just interview successful people. He studied minds. He observed behavior. He analyzed decisions. He searched for patterns where no one else was looking. Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, John D. Rockefeller. Different men, different paths, different personalities. But slowly, something began to emerge. A silent pattern. Something beneath the surface. Something that wasn't in their businesses, wasn't in their strategies, wasn't in their circumstances. It was in the way they thought, the way they interpreted reality, the way they positioned themselves internally. And the deeper he went, the clearer it became. But here is the most important part. When Hill finally began to write about his findings, he did not reveal this pattern directly. He left clues, ideas, fragments. He spoke about faith, about purpose, about autosuggestion. But the full mechanism, the real internal system, was never clearly laid out. And that was not a mistake. It was not a lack of clarity. It was intentional. Because this kind of knowledge cannot be absorbed on the surface. It must be perceived, connected, interpreted. That's why so many people read his work, feel inspired, but never truly change, because they understood the words, but missed the pattern. It's like having all the pieces of a complex system, but never learning how to assemble them. And because of that, they keep trying, without ever accessing what truly matters. But when you begin to observe more carefully, something shifts. You start to notice repetition, ideas that seem separate, but are actually part of the same structure. You begin to see that there is a method, a silent method, an internal method, a method that does not depend on the external world, but completely changes the way you interact with it. And what's even more interesting, this pattern does not appear only in Hill's work. It appears in other places, other eras, other traditions, ancient philosophers spoke about it, without using the same language. Old texts described it symbolically, and much later, science began to observe this same phenomenon through a different lens: neuroscience, cognitive psychology, behavioral studies, different paths, different languages, but pointing to the same principle. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to ignore, because it is no longer just an idea. It becomes a pattern, something consistent, something repeated, something real. But here's what changes everything. Before you can apply this method, you need to understand why it works. Because if you don't, you will repeat the same mistake most people make. You will try to use techniques without changing the structure. You will repeat words without changing your mind. You will chase results without transforming the cause, and nothing will change. So before moving forward, you need to understand something fundamental, something that completely transforms the way you see your thoughts, your decisions, and your identity. You need to understand how your mind actually works. Now, you need to understand something that completely changes the way you see yourself. Most people believe they are in control of their lives. They believe they choose what they think, what they feel, what they do. But that's not entirely true. In reality, a large part of your life is being directed by something you are not consciously aware of. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because once you understand this, you stop blaming yourself and start understanding the system. Think about your daily life. How many times do you react without thinking? How many times do you say something and only afterward realize it didn't represent who you want to be? How many times do you delay something important even knowing exactly what you should do? That's not lack of intelligence. That's not lack of discipline. That is programming. Because there is a part of your mind that operates automatically, your subconscious, and it is always active, always listening, always recording, always influencing. It doesn't rest. It doesn't pause. And most importantly, it doesn't need your permission. It simply executes. And only after that, your conscious mind steps in, trying to justify what already happened, which means many of your decisions are not truly decisions. They are responses. Automatic responses based on patterns that were built over time. Now, let's go deeper. Your subconscious is not logical. It doesn't analyze. It doesn't question. It accepts. It absorbs. It repeats. And this is exactly what neuroscience explains. Your brain is constantly forming connections, neural pathways. And every time you repeat a thought, feel an emotion, or experience something with intensity, those pathways become stronger. This is called neuroplasticity. Your brain literally reshapes itself based on what you repeatedly experience, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, internally, which means your mind is being programmed every single day, not only by what you choose, but by what you allow, by what you watch, by what you listen to, by what you repeat internally, by what you tolerate. Now think about this carefully. If someone spends years repeating thoughts like, "I'm not good enough," "I always fail," "this is not for me," even if those thoughts are not true, the brain begins to accept them as reality. Because repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity creates identity. And identity controls behavior. That's why someone can have talent and still sabotage themselves. That's why someone can have opportunity and still hesitate. That's why someone can be close to success and still pull back. Because at the deepest level, there is a program running. And that program says, this is not who you are. Now here's something even more important. Your brain does not clearly distinguish between a real experience and one that is vividly imagined with emotional intensity. This is not theory. This is neuroscience. When you imagine something in detail, your brain activates many of the same regions as if you were actually living that moment, which means your internal world is constantly shaping your external behavior, not the other way around. And that changes everything, because it means you are not limited by your current reality. You are influenced by your internal patterns, and those patterns can be changed. But here is where most people fail. They try to change their life without changing their internal repetition. They try to act differently. While thinking the same, they try to move forward, while reinforcing the same identity. And that creates conflict, because your actions are trying to go one way, while your subconscious is pulling you back. And in most cases, the subconscious wins, not because it is stronger, but because it is consistent. It has been repeated for years, reinforced by emotion, strengthened by habit, while your conscious effort is temporary, inconsistent, unstable. Now think about this analogy. Your conscious mind is like a driver, but your subconscious is the direction already programmed into the system. You can try to steer, but if the system keeps correcting your path, you will keep going back to the same destination, unless you change the programming. And that is the key. Not forcing behavior, not pushing harder, not relying on motivation. Reprogramming, changing the internal script, replacing the pattern, installing a new identity. Now here's another layer. Your subconscious is also deeply connected to emotion and survival, which means it prioritizes what feels safe, not what is right. And safe does not mean positive. Safe means familiar, even if what is familiar is limiting, even if what is familiar is painful, even if what is familiar keeps you stuck. Because from the perspective of your brain, familiar equals predictable, and predictable equals safe. So when you try to change, your mind resists, not to harm you, but to protect you from the unknown, from uncertainty, from what it cannot predict. And that's why growth feels uncomfortable, because you are stepping outside of what your mind recognizes as safe. But here is the shift. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is changing. It's a sign that you are stepping beyond your current programming. And if you understand that, you stop interpreting resistance as failure and start seeing it as part of the process. Now let's go even deeper. Every thought you repeat creates a reference. Every emotion you reinforce creates a pattern. Every experience you internalize builds identity. And over time, this becomes automatic. You no longer question. You no longer analyze. You simply act based on who you believe you are. That's why awareness is the first step, because you cannot change what you cannot see. And once you begin to observe, once you begin to notice, once you begin to interrupt, you create space. And in that space, you gain control. Not full control at first, but enough to start changing direction. And that is where the method begins to make sense. Because everything that was hidden between the lines was not just philosophy. It was a system, a way to access this part of the mind and reshape it. But there is one key that most people still ignore. And without this key, everything remains incomplete. Because understanding the system is not enough. You need to apply it in a specific way. And that is exactly what you are about to see next. Now, everything begins to make sense. What once seemed like scattered ideas, random concepts, isolated principles, is actually part of a structure, a system, a method. And this method is not based on motivation. It is not based on inspiration. It is not based on temporary effort. It is based on how your brain actually works. This is neuroscience. This is pattern recognition. This is mental conditioning. And when you understand this, you stop trying to change your life randomly and start working with precision, because your mind is not chaotic. It follows rules, and once you understand those rules, you can begin to direct it. This entire method is built on 3 pillars, and if you truly understand these 3, you begin to see everything differently. 1. Repetition with emotion, real autosuggestion. Most people think repetition means saying something many times, but repetition alone is not enough. Because your subconscious does not respond to words. It responds to emotional intensity. It responds to experience. It responds to what feels real. Now think about this. You can say something 100 times without feeling anything, and nothing changes. But one emotionally intense experience can shape your behavior for years. That's because emotion acts as a signal to the brain. It tells your system, this matters, store this, reinforce this, and this is where neuroscience becomes very clear. When emotion is involved, your brain releases chemicals that strengthen neural connections. That means the experience is encoded more deeply, more strongly, more permanently. So when you combine repetition with emotion, you accelerate the process of change. You are not just thinking something, you are installing it. Now let's make this practical. If someone constantly says, I want to be confident, but internally feels doubt, the subconscious ignores the words, because the emotion is stronger than the statement. But if that same person begins to feel confidence even in small moments, and repeats that state, something begins to shift. Because now, the brain is receiving a coherent signal. Thought and emotion, aligned, and alignment, is what creates change. This is why Hill emphasized faith with intensity. Not passive belief, but emotional conviction. The ability to feel something as real before it becomes real. Because to the subconscious, what is emotionally experienced is already true. 2. Intentional silence, deep access and reprogramming window. Now we move to something that most people completely underestimate. Silence. Not silence as the absence of noise, but silence as a tool, a state, a gateway. Because without silence, you are constantly reacting. But in silence, you begin to observe. And observation creates awareness. Now let's bring in neuroscience again. Your brain operates in different states, fast, active states, associated with constant thinking, analysis, reaction, and slower states associated with internal processing, memory, and deeper access. When you are constantly distracted, your brain stays in high-frequency activity. You are reacting, but not processing. You are consuming, but not understanding. But when you enter intentional silence, your brain begins to slow down. And when it slows down, something important happens. The barrier between conscious and subconscious becomes thinner. You gain access. This is where insights appear, patterns become visible, hidden beliefs surface. And this is critical, because you cannot change what you cannot identify. Most people try to fix their lives without ever diagnosing the real problem. They treat symptoms. They don't understand causes. But silence reveals the cause. It shows you the pattern. It exposes the automatic thought. It brings awareness to what was invisible. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now let's go deeper. Silence is not just observation. It is also a window. A moment where your mind is more receptive, more open, more influenceable, which means this is the perfect state to begin reprogramming. Not when you are distracted, not when you are overwhelmed, but when you are still, focused, present. Because in that state, what you introduce into your mind has more impact, more depth, more permanence. 3. Dominant mental image, identity programming. Now we arrive at the most powerful pillar, your dominant mental image, your identity, the internal picture you hold of who you are. Because this image controls everything, not your goals, not your desires, your identity. Because you will always act in alignment with who you believe you are. Now let's bring this into reality. If someone believes, I am not consistent, they will start strong and then stop. If someone believes, I'm not good with money, they will earn and then lose. If someone believes, this level is not for me, they will approach success and then retreat. Not consciously, automatically, because the subconscious is protecting identity. Now here's where neuroscience becomes powerful again. Your brain responds to mental imagery as if it were real. When you visualize something vividly, your brain activates the same neural circuits as actual experience, which means you can begin to build a new identity before it exists externally. You can rehearse, you can simulate, you can train. And the more you repeat that internal image with emotion, the more your brain begins to accept it as reality. Now think about the implications of this. You are no longer waiting for life to change, to feel different. You are training yourself to become different so life can follow. And this is the shift most people never make. They wait for external proof before changing internally. But the process works in reverse. Internal first, external later. And once that internal image stabilizes, your behavior begins to align, not forced, natural, because now you are no longer trying to act differently. You are acting consistently with who you believe you are. Integration, how the system actually works. Now bring everything together. Repetition with emotion. Installs, silence reveals, mental imagery, defines. This is not theory, this is a system. You identify the pattern. You interrupt the pattern. You replace the pattern. You reinforce the new identity. And over time, what once required effort becomes automatic, just like the old patterns did, because the goal is not to fight your mind. It is to retrain it, to align with it, to use the system instead of being controlled by it. Now here's something you need to understand clearly. This process is not instant, because your current patterns were not built in a day. They were built through repetition, through emotion, through time. So the same principle applies. Consistency, repetition, emotional reinforcement. That's what creates change. And the moment you commit to that, you stop being someone who tries and become someone who transforms. Because now, you are no longer guessing. You are following a system, a structure, a method, and that changes everything. Now, even after understanding all of this, most people still don't change. And that's not because the method doesn't work. It's because something is working against them. Something subtle, something constant, something almost invisible. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because this enemy is not outside. It's not your environment. It's not other people. It's not your circumstances. It's inside your mind, a silent pattern that keeps you exactly where you are. Napoleon Hill described this in a way that many people underestimated. He called it drifting, mental drift. And this might be the most dangerous state a person can live in, because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels normal. You wake up, you go through your day, you respond to things, you move from one task to another, but there is no clear direction, no intentional focus, no conscious control, and slowly, without noticing, you lose command of your own mind. Now think about your own routine. How often do you reach for your phone without deciding to? How often do you open something and forget why you opened it? How often do you start something important and then get pulled into something irrelevant? That's not coincidence. That's drift. Your attention is being pulled instead of directed, and attention is one of the most valuable resources you have, because where your attention goes, your life follows. Now let's bring this into neuroscience. Your brain is constantly seeking efficiency. It creates automatic patterns to reduce effort. That's why habits exist. That's why routines feel easier over time. But here's the problem. If those patterns are not consciously directed, they become automatic loops, and those loops start running your life. This is what happens in drift. You are no longer choosing. You are reacting. You are no longer directing. You are being directed. And the more this repeats, the stronger those loops become. The stronger they become, the harder it is to break them. Now here's something even deeper. Drift is not just distraction. It is disconnection. Disconnection from intention. Disconnection from awareness. Disconnection from identity. You are moving, but without alignment. Acting, but without purpose. Living, but without direction. And this creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion that you are doing something, when in reality, you are just repeating patterns. Days pass, weeks pass, months pass, and nothing truly changes. Not because you lack effort, but because your effort is not aligned with intention. Now think about this carefully. It's not that you are making bad decisions. It's that you are not making decisions at all. You are defaulting. And when you default, your past conditioning takes over. Your habits decide. Your beliefs decide. Your patterns decide. And that's why people feel stuck. Not because they can't move forward, but because something keeps pulling them back. And that something is invisible. Now let's go deeper. Your subconscious is designed to conserve energy. It prefers automatic behavior. It prefers repetition. It prefers predictability. So when you enter drift, your brain relaxes into default mode. It stops questioning. It stops evaluating. It simply follows what is familiar. And this is where self-sabotage begins. Not as a dramatic action, but as a quiet pattern. You delay. You avoid. You distract. You postpone. Not because you want to fail, but because your system is not aligned with change. And over time, these small patterns create massive consequences, because repetition builds identity, and identity shapes your life. Now, here is the most important part. The biggest danger is not making a mistake. The biggest danger is repeating a mistake without noticing, because when you notice, you can interrupt, but when you don't, you reinforce, and reinforcement creates permanence. Now think about how many times people say, "I don't know why I keep doing this." That's the sign. That's drift. That's lack of awareness. And without awareness, there is no control. But the moment awareness enters, everything begins to change. Because awareness interrupts the pattern, it creates a gap. And inside that gap, you gain choice. Not full control at once, but enough to start shifting direction. Now, here's something powerful. You don't break drift with force. You break it with presence. You don't overcome it by pushing harder. You overcome it by becoming aware. Because the moment you become aware, the automatic weakens. The moment you observe, the loop is interrupted. The moment you choose intentionally, you step out of drift. And this is where control begins. Now let's make this practical. The next time you reach for your phone, pause. Ask yourself, did I choose this? Or did it happen automatically? The next time you feel resistance, pause. Ask yourself, is this real or is this a pattern? The next time you delay something important, pause. Ask yourself, am I deciding or am I drifting? These small interruptions. Begin to rewire your system, because every time you choose consciously, you weaken the old pattern, and every time you repeat that, You build a new one. Now here's the shift. Most people try to change their life in big ways. Big goals, big actions, big decisions. But real change happens in small moments, in micro decisions, in daily awareness. Because that's where patterns live, and that's where they are broken. Now understand this clearly. The enemy is not visible. You won't see it directly. You will feel it through distraction, through hesitation, through inconsistency, through lack of clarity. But once you understand it, you can no longer ignore it. And that changes everything, because now you are no longer unconscious. You are aware, and awareness is the beginning of control. But there is still one piece missing, because awareness alone does not complete the process. You need structure. You need direction. You need a system to replace what you are removing. And that is exactly what you are about to apply next. Now, everything comes down to one point, because up to this moment, you've understood the problem. You've understood the system. You've understood the method. But none of that truly works unless you make one specific change, a change that is not in your behavior, not in your effort. It's in your identity. And this is what most people never realize. They try to act differently without seeing themselves differently. They try to change habits without changing who they believe they are. And that's why every change fades, because behavior always returns to the original identity. You might push yourself for a few days, but if deep down you still believe you are the same person, the pattern comes back. It always comes back. Now pay close attention to this. You don't act according to what you want. You act according to who you believe you are. That is the rule. If your internal identity says, "I'm not disciplined," you will break consistency. "I don't finish what I start," you will stop halfway. "This is not for me." You will sabotage yourself before you get there, even without realizing it. And that is exactly why real change does not start on the outside. It starts within. It begins the moment you decide to stop seeing yourself as the old version and start building a new identity. But here is the detail most people miss. Identity does not change through thinking alone. It changes through repetition, with emotion, and consistency. It changes when you begin to train your mind to accept a new version of yourself. And that does not happen automatically. It requires structure. It requires practice. It requires intention. And that is exactly what you are about to apply. The practical reprogramming plan, first 7 days. You don't need months to begin. You don't need to change everything at once. But you do need to start. And the beginning is simple. But it must be done with awareness. For the next 7 days, you will follow a daily process. Short, but powerful. And if done the right way, it begins to reshape your internal narrative. Part 1, silence 5 minutes. Every day, start with silence. No phone, no distractions. Just you and your mind. Take a deep breath and observe. Don't try to control your thoughts. Just notice them. What shows up? What patterns repeat automatically? This is where you begin to see what was previously invisible. Part 2, SELF questioning 5 minutes. Now, ask yourself questions. Direct questions, without filters, without judgment. What thought limited me yesterday? At what moment did I hold back, even though I knew what I should do? What belief was behind that? Write it down, because when you write, you take it out of your mind and bring it into awareness. And what becomes conscious can be changed. Part 3, reprogramming 5 minutes. Now comes the most important part. You are going to replace the pattern, but not with empty words, with emotion. Choose a new belief, the opposite of what has been limiting you, and repeat it, out loud or internally, but with intensity. Feel it as if it were already true, as if it were already you, because that is what your subconscious understands. Not words, but internal experiences. Part 4. Visualization, night 10 minutes. Before you sleep, enter a more relaxed state, slower, calmer, and visualize. But don't visualize in a superficial way. Go into detail. See yourself acting differently, speaking differently, making decisions differently, showing up differently. Feel it, live it mentally, because in this state, your mind is more open, more receptive, more influenceable, and that accelerates the reprogramming process. What begins to happen if you do this for a few days? Something starts to shift. Small things, but real. You begin to notice your thoughts. You begin to interrupt patterns. You begin to respond differently. You begin to question what once felt normal. And that is the beginning of transformation. This is not magic. This is not instant. But it is real, because you are no longer trying to change on the surface. You are changing the structure. And when the structure changes, everything else follows. The final truth. Now, I want you to understand this clearly. You are not stuck. You are conditioned. And everything that has been conditioned can be reconditioned, but only if you take responsibility, if you apply, if you repeat, if you persist, because this process does not depend on motivation. It depends on decision, and that decision is yours. Now, let me tell you something very clearly. If you made it this far, that already says a lot about you. Most people start, but they don't finish. They get distracted. They lose focus. They move on to something else. But you stayed. You kept listening. You kept thinking. You kept going. And that is not by accident. That is a signal. A signal that there is something inside you that refuses to stay the same. Something that knows you are capable of more. Something that is tired of repeating the same patterns. And that is where everything begins. Because every real transformation starts with awareness, not motivation, not pressure. Awareness. The moment you see clearly what was once invisible, you can no longer go back to the same level of unconsciousness. You start noticing things. You start catching your own thoughts. You start questioning reactions that used to feel automatic. And that is the beginning of control. Now you understand something most people never do. You understand that the problem was never a lack of ability. It was never a lack of opportunity. It was never a lack of intelligence. It was programming, silent programming, repeated over time, reinforced by emotion, accepted as truth. And everything that has been programmed can be reprogrammed, but only if you decide. Because this is where most people stop. They understand, but they don't act. They feel inspired, but they don't apply. They agree, but they don't change. And then nothing happens, because knowledge without action is just entertainment. And this video was not made to entertain you. It was made to wake you up, to show you something you can no longer ignore. Now, I want to take you one step deeper, because there is a question that you cannot leave this video without answering. And this question is not for now. It's for the next few days, the next decisions you make, the next moments where you hesitate. The question is this: what is the belief about yourself that, if it were not true, would completely change your life? Think about that slowly, not on the surface. Go deeper. Is it the belief that you are not enough? That you always fail? That you are late? That you don't have what it takes? Because if that belief is not absolute truth, then what you have been living is not your limit. It's your conditioning. And if it is conditioning, it can be changed. But here is where it becomes real. Change does not happen when you understand this once. It happens when you repeat, when you practice, when you interrupt the old pattern again and again, when you choose differently, even when it feels uncomfortable, because real change will feel unfamiliar at first, and your mind will try to pull you back to what is easy, back to what is known, back to what is comfortable. But now you know what that is. You know it's not you. It's the pattern. And that changes everything, because now, when resistance shows up, you won't see it as a sign to stop. You'll see it as a sign that you are changing. And that is the shift. That is the moment where you stop being controlled and start becoming intentional. Now, let's make this real. I want you to go to the comments and write this sentence. My mind is ready for a new level, but don't just type it. Pause for a second and decide what it means. Because when you write something with intention, you are not just expressing a thought. You are declaring a direction. You are telling your mind, this is who I am becoming. And the more you reinforce that, the more your mind begins to follow. If this message resonated with you, take one more step. Leave a like. Not just as a reaction, but as a signal. A signal that this message matters. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this is not a one-time shift. This is a process, and here you will continue building it. Video by video, thought by thought, decision by decision. And if you know someone who is stuck in the same patterns, share this video with them, because sometimes people don't need more advice. They need awareness. They need to see what they couldn't see before. And one single idea at the right moment can completely redirect a life. And I want to leave you with this. Whatever the mind can conceive and truly believe, it can build. Not instantly, not magically, but consistently, through aligned thought, aligned emotion, and aligned action. But before all of that, you need to decide. Decide to become aware. Decide to stop drifting. Decide to take control. Decide not to go back to the same unconscious patterns. And that decision does not belong to tomorrow. It belongs to now, right now.